Hello friends, Chris from doWhileLoops here, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at the CAGED system. In my opinion, this is one of the best investments that you can make for the rest of your guitar playing life. It totally demystifies the fretboard and lets you know exactly what you're playing and why you're playing it. So let's hit it. Alright, so there's some controversy about who actually invented the CAGED system. Me personally, I first heard about this in the book Fretboard Logic by Bill Edwards, but regardless of who may have invented it, it's just the way that the guitar works. As soon as you can zoom out and start seeing the fretboard as a whole, rather than a bunch of random scales and chords all over the place, then you're on your way. So let's start off by learning about why it's called the CAGED system, and we'll go from there. Okay, so this is called the CAGED system because it uses the chords C, A, G, E, D in that order to make a map of the fretboard. The idea is that these chords connect with each other in that order. This will make more sense in a minute, but for starters, you should be familiar and comfortable with these chords. To start out with, we're going to use all of the major forms of the chord, and here they are on the screen. Just for example, we've got C major, A major, G major, E major, and D major. Good stuff. Okay, so there's our chords. Now, let me show you the trick. So for example, let's take a look at the C major chord down here. And normally we fret this with our third finger, second finger, and first finger, like this. I'm going to switch it up. I'm going to go my pinky, third, and second finger, like this. Same chord. Now, check it out. This part of your guitar right here is called the guitar nut. And that's basically the end of the guitar strings. Not much happens down here past this point. So that's basically the end right here. So if I take my new fancy fingering and I just lay my index finger over the nut, just for example, then you can see that this guitar shape becomes movable up and down the neck as long as this shape stays relative to whatever the end of the string is, which is being supplied by your index finger right here. So just for example, here's if I put the end of the string at the third fret, there we go. And if I put the end at the 8th fret, here it is. And there you go. And if you've ever played with a capo before, this is exactly the same concept. Capo provides a temporary new end of the strings, and this is exactly what you're doing when you're barring your index finger across the strings. So here's an example of moving each of these chord shapes up and down the neck. And if these shapes seem intimidating to you, don't worry. We'll get to that a little bit later in the video. So we just saw our C major. Now let's take our A major. Move it up to the 3rd fret. Move it up to the 8th fret. Very cool. Let's take our G major. This one's a little tricky, so I'll probably arpeggiate it. Let's put the end at the 3rd fret. There we go. And let's put the end at the 8th fret. Nailed it. Let's go with the E major. End at the 3rd fret. End at the 8th fret. Let's go with the D major. At the 3rd. And at the 8th. Movable guitar shapes. Okay, so let's quickly shift over and look at some music theory. Now, a major chord is made up of the 1st, 3rd, and 5th degrees of the scale that it's based on. Sticking with C major as our example, there's a 1-octave C major scale up and down. Now, if I just take the 1st, 3rd, and 5th degrees of that scale, here's what that sounds like. And if I put an extra 1st degree, which is also called a root, if I put that up on top of that, here's what that sounds like. And If I take the C major chord that we all know and love, you'll hear that that is what makes this up. And in fact, that's what all these basic forms of the chords are. They're different arrangements of the first, third, and fifth degrees of the scale arranged in shapes that are known on the guitar. Also, although we refer to each of these chords by the name of the key that it's in when it's down here in open position, it's best to start thinking of these chords as shapes. These shapes are movable up and down the neck by using your finger as a capo, as we saw earlier. This all makes sense shortly, but for now, here's a screenshot of the arrangement of the first, third, and fifth degrees within each chord shape. Experiment around with these so you can hear these in action. And by the way, if you want to connect the dots a little bit more with music theory, I'll put a link to the complete starter kit video that I did right here and in the description. But for now, let's move on to putting all these pieces together. Okay, so here we are. Now the reason why this is called the CAGED system is because these chord shapes appear in that order up and down the guitar deck, C, A, G, E, D. These chord shapes overlap and they connect with each other on the first degree of the chord within each shape, and here's what I mean by that. So let's stick with the key of C. Here's our C chord shape down here in open position, and there are two first degrees within this chord shape, on the third fret of the A string and on the first fret of the B string. By the way, the first degree is also called the root, and that's what I'm going to call it from now on. Okay, so far so good. Now, we've got our C shape down here in the key of C, and now to connect it to our next chord shape in the CAGED sequence, which is the A chord shape. So what we're going to do is we're going to look for basically the last root as you're moving up the neck to connect it to. So we've got our C here, right here, third fret. That's what we're going to shoot for. Remember that one. Okay, so our A chord shape is right here. Our two roots are on the open A string and the second fret of the G string. So if we shift that whole shape up, so the root is on the last outermost root, which is the third fret, remember, we'll hear this, which sounds remarkably similar to our C chord shape. Awesome. Okay, now let's find our outermost root, which is going to be the fifth fret of the G string. And then we go to our next chord shape in our sequence, which is the G major shape, which is what I'm going to do here, this fancy fingering. So our three roots, we have three roots in this one. We've got both of our E strings and the open G string right there. So if I transfer this whole thing up to line up with the last root, which will be on the fifth fret, I'm going to get this. These shapes are kind of hard. I'll cover that in a minute. But anyway, you can see that my index finger is barring the three frets on the fifth string, the three strings on the fifth fret, just like they do in the A chord shape. Just like that. So you're starting to see how this is coming together. Cool. So let's find our next outermost root, which will be on both of the E strings here on the 8th fret. Remember that. So we've gone C form, A form, G form, and now we need our E form, which is down here. Our three roots are the open E strings, 1, 2, and the second fret of the D string. And if we transfer this whole shape up to, remember, our 8th fret, we're going to get this. Awesome. And our outermost root here is going to be the 10th fret of the D string. Cool. 10th fret of the D string. So now, let's go back down here to our last chord shape. Our roots are open D and 3rd fret of B string. If I transfer this whole thing up to our last known outermost root, that's going to be the 10th fret. Awesome. So we've got C form, A form, G form, E form, D form. Cool, except we're out of chords. Now what do we do? Well, it's just like musical notes. It just starts over again. So we'll just make our C form at the last root, or the outermost last root, which would be the 13th fret of the B string. And we will wind up with something like this. That's hard to play. Here's a little factoid if you don't know. The 12th fret on the guitar is basically a 1 octave mark. So the guitar can kind of be viewed as quote unquote starting over at that point in time. You'll see that my open position C chord down here and up here is exactly 1 octave higher. So just a little factoid if you don't know. But anyway, that's pretty much it. That's the gist of the CAGED system. You're lining up the roots and you're just moving in that order up and down the neck. And that's it. Here's a screenshot of the full CAGED system in the key of C. So pause this, experiment around, do whatever you need to do. And yeah, let's move on and look at some more examples. Okay, cool. So a couple of things before we move on to some more examples. Number one, some of these shapes in the CAGED system just are not going to be practical to make on the fretboard. And in fact, that's not the point of the CAGED system. The whole point of the CAGED system is to be able to visualize the fretboard, not to be able to finagle your fingers into a bunch of crazy shapes that you might not ever use. But what you can do is basically arpeggiate the chords. So instead of holding down the whole chord shape, you just play one note at a time and then lift your fingers up like this, and that'll help you get the feel for it. The second point here is that this system and the guitar in general is a lot easier if you know the names of the notes on the low E and the A string. You remember that most of the chord shapes in the CAGED system have their roots on the low E and the A string, and you'll thank yourself later if you start to learn where these notes are at. The easiest way to do that is to start developing what they call anchor notes on each string. These are basically places on the fretboard that you know the names of the notes to. Start with a few of these and the blanks will start to fill themselves in. For example, you already know that an open E string is the note E, and the open A string is the note A. We also learned earlier that the 12th fret on the guitar is an octave above an open string. That means that the 12th fret on each of these strings is indeed E and A. If you take the 7th fret on each string, just for example, that's B and E. Over time, start learning the notes on the 3rd fret, the 5th fret, etc. Here's all the notes on these two strings up to the 12th fret. Feel free to pause or take a screenshot so you can internalize these. And as always, the more you learn, the easier it gets. The good news is that you only have to learn all this once. As long as you remain in standard tuning, then you'll know the way that the guitar works, and you won't have to invest the time into learning it again. Okay, so for a second example, let's take a look at the key of G. So we know that in the G chord shape, our root is on the low E string. And if we take a look at the note names on the E and the A strings again, we can see that the G note on the E string is right here on the 3rd fret. If we make the G chord shape right there, then lo and behold, there's the classic G chord that we all know and love. So, in our earlier example of the key of C, we started on C in the CAGED system, which is the first letter. But what if we start in the middle of the word CAGED? Well, no big deal. We just continue from wherever you start. So here we are on our G. The next thing we're going to need is our E shape on the outermost root, which is the 3rd fret of the E string there. Let's get our E chord shape. Root is on the open E string, so that needs to slide up to the 3rd fret. Very nice, very nice. Next comes the D chord shape, 5th fret of D string. Let's get our D chord shape, root right here, 5th fret of D string. Too easy, right? Next, next root is the 8th fret of B string. We're going to need C chord, which that root is right here. So that needs to go on the 8th fret. Just like that. Outermost root, 10th fret of A string. We're going to need the A shape right here. Root, open A string, 10th fret, slide it on up. And there you go. Here's a little trick. These 3 strings, the D, G, and B strings that you bar on the A chord shape, are kind of a nice little anchor point. It's just kind of a thing that everybody seems to recognize going up and down the neck. So it's a nice little kind of anchor, if you will, that you can use to see where you're at. But nonetheless, there's our A chord shape. Now we need to complete the octave and go to our G chord shape. There it is. Our root is going to be on the open G string here. So let's slide it up here. Once again, I nailed the G chord shape, but nonetheless, there it is right there. And there's nothing to it. So hopefully you can see now what an advantage of knowing the note names on the E and the A string is. So as long as you know those, you can start the CAGED system basically anywhere on the fretboard on any note and find your way around. Quick note here, if you want to take your playing to the next level and you're looking for somebody to help you get there, I've got over 20 years of playing and teaching experience on trumpet, guitar, piano, songwriting, theory, and a whole host of other musical subjects. I'd love to help out. Send me a message on my website. The link is here and in the description. Mention code CLEM20 and get 20% off your first lesson. Now back to the show. Okay, so far we've only done major chords and keys. But what about minor chords and keys? Well, the only difference between a basic major and a basic minor chord is the third. Here's an example. Here's a C major chord, which is C, E, G. And now here's a C minor chord, which is C, E flat, G. And that means that if you know where your thirds are within each chord shape, then all you have to do is drop those down a half step and you've got the minor version. So check out this example of the CAGED system in C minor. And you'll see that the chord shapes start to get a little bit fuzzy. They kind of start to bleed into the shapes that come before and after them, and that's strictly a result of having to drop the thirds down a half step. As we discussed before, the point of the CAGED system is not to contort your fingers all over the place and possibly hurt yourself. It's just primarily a tool to visualize your way around the neck. Remember, a good thing to do is to arpeggiate each note within each shape rather than try to play the entire chord at once. Alright, practice. So there's several different ways you can go about practicing this stuff. One great way is to take songs that you already know and practice them in different areas of the fretboard. For example, if you got a song that goes from C to G, like so, then try to play that same thing in different areas of the guitar neck. So here we had C to G, but if I use the A shape of my C chords right here, then it goes a little something like this. You can also play it up here in the E shape on the 8th fret. That's great practice. You can do that with riffs. You can do that with melodies. You can also take those same chords and transpose them into new keys now that you know how that works. So here we are with the A shape of our C chord again with the root on the 3rd fret. If I transfer that root up to the 5th fret, which is the D, all of a sudden I'm playing in the key of D. There you go. That's great practice. Another thing you can do is you can try to find your 1, 3, 5 within each chord and then find it in each shape up and down the neck. By the way, 1, 3, 5 is called a triad. But here's an example in the key of C. There's our C shape. Here's our A shape. Here's our G shape. Here's our E shape. Here's our D shape up an octave. Then here's our C shape. There you go. Get creative, man. Okay, that's it, friends. That's the CAGED system on the guitar. Get comfortable with that and your playing will definitely go to the next level. I appreciate you watching the video today. Please drop a like on the video if you got something out of it. And if you're new here, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. You'll be the first one to know and it don't cost nothing. Aside from that, Clemons from doWhileLoops, take it easy and enjoy making music.